Good evening and welcome, beautiful viewer. Please find that quiet place once more. Let the world outside recede. We are about to travel to a land of breathtaking beauty and terrifying violence, a place where art and death were woven into a single, inseparable tapestry. Leave a comment with your time and location, a small anchor in the present before we step into the past. We are going to journey beyond the image of the noble warrior, beyond the cherry blossoms and the elegant steel. We are going to uncover the truth of a life governed by a code so rigid and a reality so harsh that it is almost impossible for us to comprehend. This is the story of the samurai and the profound, unending brutality that forged them. The word samurai itself conjures a powerful and romantic image, one carefully curated by centuries of stories, art, and modern cinema. We see a lone warrior, his face a mask of serene discipline, his hands resting on the hilt of a perfectly crafted katana. He is a philosopher-poet, capable of composing a delicate verse on the fleeting beauty of a firefly one moment and cutting down a dozen enemies with inhuman grace the next. He lives and dies by Bushido, a noble code of honor, courage, and self-sacrifice. He is the embodiment of controlled strength and spiritual refinement. This image is beautiful, it is compelling, and it is, for the most part, a lie. It is a ghost, a carefully constructed ideal that polishes away the blood, the filth, and the crushing psychological horror that define the existence of the true ancient warrior class of Japan. To find the real samurai, we must strip away the silk and poetry and look at the brutal machine of violence that lay beneath. The origins of the samurai were not noble. They were not born from an imperial decree or a philosophical movement. They arose from the mud and blood of provincial necessity. In the Heian period, from the 8th to the 12th centuries, the power of the emperor and his court in the capital, Heian-kyo, which we now call Kyoto, began to wane. The court became an isolated world of immense cultural refinement, obsessed with aesthetic pursuits, complex etiquette, and courtly romance. While the nobles in the capital wrote poetry and played incense-guessing games, their control over the vast provinces of Japan slipped away. Large, tax-exempt private estates, called shoen, began to dominate the countryside. The owners of these estates, powerful provincial families, found that they could no longer rely on the distant, preoccupied central government for protection. They were beset by bandits, pirates, and most importantly, each other. To survive in this violent and lawless frontier, they needed to raise their own private armies. They needed men who served. This is the origin of the word. Samurai comes from the verb saburao, which means to serve or to wait upon. The first samurai were not a distinct class of nobility. They were armed retainers, professional soldiers, essentially hired security for the provincial elite. They were specialists in violence, and their primary weapon was not the sword. The iconic image of the samurai as a master swordsman is largely a product of the later, more peaceful Edo period. The ancient samurai, the warrior of the Heian and Kamakura periods, was first and foremost a mounted archer. His entire method of warfare was built around the yumi, a long, asymmetrical bow of astonishing power, and his skill in using it from the back of a speeding horse. The battlefield was not a place of elegant duels. It was a chaotic storm of arrows. A samurai's training from boyhood was focused on mastering the horse and the bow, on being able to fire accurately in any direction, at any speed, in any weather. A volley of arrows from a unit of trained samurai archers was a terrifying spectacle, a storm of iron-tipped death that could decimate enemy formations before they even came close. The sword, the katana, was a secondary weapon, a sidearm used for close-quarters fighting after a warrior was unhorsed, or for the grim business of taking heads after a battle. But the sword was also where the soul of the samurai was said to reside, and its creation and use were steeped in ritual and a sense of profound purpose. The training to wield it was relentless. From a young age, a samurai's son would begin his practice, first with a wooden sword, a bokken, and then with the real blade. He would practice thousands upon thousands of cuts, day after day, year after year, until the sword became a seamless extension of his will. The goal was not just to learn techniques, but to achieve a state of mind called mushin, or no mind, where the body reacts instantly, without conscious thought, without fear, without hesitation. This training was brutal. It involved endless repetition, harsh discipline, and sparring sessions with real blades that could easily lead to injury or death. A moment's distraction, a flicker of fear, could be fatal. This physical training, however, was perhaps the least brutal part of a young samurai's upbringing. The true horror lay in the psychological conditioning, a systematic process designed to cauterize the parts of the psyche that made a boy human and replace them with the cold, hard wiring of a killer. A samurai was not supposed to fear death. He was taught to live with death as his constant companion, to see his own life as a temporary state, a tool to be used and discarded in the service of his lord. To achieve this, a boy would be subjected to a horrifying curriculum of desensitization. He would be forced to attend executions, to watch as criminals were beheaded, and to look upon the severed heads without flinching. He would be sent, alone and at night, to graveyards or battlefields littered with the dead and the dying, and ordered to stay there until dawn, to meditate upon the impermanence of life and conquer his primal fear of the dark and the dead. Some accounts speak of boys being made to handle the severed heads, to mark them as trophies, becoming accustomed to the sight, smell, and feel of death. The goal was to scour every trace of fear and revulsion from his soul, to make violence as natural to him as breathing. Empathy was another dangerous emotion that had to be suppressed. A samurai served his lord, his daimyo, with absolute and unquestioning loyalty. If his lord commanded him to burn a village full of peasants, to slaughter the family of a rival, or to kill his own childhood friend, he was expected to do so without a moment's hesitation or a flicker of remorse. To feel for the enemy, to pity the victim, was a weakness that could compromise his duty. This loyalty was the bedrock of the entire samurai system. It was a bond more powerful than family, love, or personal morality. A samurai's life did not belong to him. It belonged to his lord. His honor was not his own. It was a reflection of his lord's honor. And this concept of honor, or meiyo, was not a gentle virtue. It was a crushing, tyrannical weight. Every action, every word, every breath a samurai took was measured against an impossibly high standard. A single mistake, a moment of cowardice in battle, a perceived insult that went unanswered, or a failure to carry out a command could bring not just personal shame, but a stain upon his entire family for generations. The fear of dishonor was far more profound than the fear of death. Death was an honorable end. Dishonor was a living hell, a social oblivion that erased a man and his family from the world of the respectable. And from this terrible fear of dishonor arose the most infamous and brutal ritual of samurai life, seppuku. We often think of seppuku, or harakiri as it is more vulgarly known, as an act of ultimate protest or a way of preserving one's honor after defeat. It was both of these things, but it was also much more. It was the ultimate expression of the samurai code's brutality turned inward. It was a required, institutionalized form of suicide, a gruesome and highly ritualized performance of self-destruction. It was the only acceptable exit for a samurai who had failed. If a samurai was defeated in battle, captured by the enemy, or had disgraced his lord, seppuku was often his only path to redeem his name. Sometimes, a lord would command a loyal samurai to commit seppuku as a punishment or to resolve a political problem. To refuse was unthinkable. The act itself was a masterpiece of cold, ritualized horror. It was a formal ceremony. The samurai would be dressed in a white kimono, the color of death and purity. He would kneel on a tatami mat, often in a garden or a temple. Before him would be placed a small ceremonial tray holding a short blade, the tanto. After composing himself, perhaps writing a final death poem, he would take the blade. The cut was precise and agonizing. He would plunge the blade into the left side of his abdomen, draw it across to the right, and then, if he had the strength, make a final upward cut. The purpose of this disembowelment was symbolic. It was a way of showing, in the most visceral way possible, the purity of his spirit, literally spilling his guts to prove there was no stain of cowardice or deceit within. The pain was, by all accounts, beyond human imagination. Because the agony of the act could cause a man to cry out or lose his composure, which would be a final dishonor, a trusted second, called the kaishakunin, was an essential part of the ritual. The kaishakunin, often a close friend or a skilled swordsman, stood behind the kneeling samurai with his own sword drawn. His role was to perform a merciful beheading the moment the samurai had made his cut, or at the first sign that his resolve was failing. This was not a full decapitation. The perfect cut, known as dakikubi, was to sever the neck but leave a small flap of skin at the front so that the head would slump forward into the man's arms, as if in a final bow, rather than rolling away in an undignified manner. To be a kaishakunin was a position of immense honor and terrible responsibility. A single, clumsy stroke could multiply the agony and dishonor of the friend he was trying to help. This was the brutal equation at the heart of the samurai's life. A lifetime of relentless, soul-crushing training to become the perfect servant and killer, all lived under the constant threat of a dishonor so profound that the only escape was to ritually and agonizingly disembowel yourself. The cherry blossom, so often associated with the samurai, was a fitting symbol, but not for the reasons we imagine. It was a symbol of their life because its beauty was intense, but breathtakingly brief, destined to be cut down in its prime. The life of a samurai was not a poem. It was a tightrope walk over a pit of shame, where the only safety net was a blade pointed at his own stomach. This unforgiving code, forged in the violent frontiers of ancient Japan, created not supermen, but tragic figures, men who were turned into exquisitely crafted, disposable weapons, their humanity a casualty of the brutal code they were forced to serve. The boy has been broken, his fear cauterized, his life pledged to a code of service and death, but the training is over. The philosophical lessons must now be set aside. The call to war has come. It is time to move from the sterile training ground to the blood-soaked reality of the battlefield, a place far removed from any notion of honor or glory. It was an abattoir, a human slaughterhouse, where a man's worth was measured not by his courage, but by the number of heads he could carry home. When a lord, a daimyo, summoned his vassals to war, a samurai's life would change in an instant. Any semblance of domesticity, of managing his small estate or overseeing peasants, vanished. He was now, in function and in spirit, nothing more than a weapon to be deployed. The first step in this transformation was the donning of the armor, the yoroi. This was not a simple matter of slipping on a breastplate. It was a complex, time-consuming ritual, often requiring the help of an attendant. And the armor itself was a brutal paradox. It was his protection, but it was also a cage, a crushing weight that would be his constant companion for days or weeks on end. The great armor of the classical samurai, the oyoroi, was a masterpiece of construction, made of thousands of small, lacquered iron or leather scales called kozain, painstakingly bound together with brightly colored silk or leather cords. It was a thing of terrible beauty, but its functionality was grim. The full suit could weigh upwards of 60 pounds. Imagine the sheer physical burden. The heavy helmet, the kabuto, with its sweeping neck guard, was hot, claustrophobic, and severely restricted hearing and peripheral vision. The warrior was isolated inside his own steel shell, his senses dulled, the world reduced to what he could see through the narrow slit of his face mask or mempo. These masks were often fashioned into terrifying demonic or bestial visages, designed not just for protection, but to dehumanize the wearer and strike fear into the enemy. The samurai peered out from behind the face of a demon, a psychological reminder of the monstrous work he was about to undertake. To march for days in this armor, to sleep in it, and then to fight in it required a level of physical endurance that is almost unimaginable. The march to battle was itself an ordeal. Armies moved slowly, a great river of men and horses winding through the mountainous terrain of Japan. The logistics were a nightmare. Food was scarce. Disease could sweep through a camp, killing more men than the enemy ever would. The samurai, for all his status, was not immune. He would suffer from the same dysentery, the same hunger, the same biting insects as the lowly foot soldiers, the ashigaru, who accompanied him. The march was a process of attrition, a slow wearing down of body and spirit before the first arrow was ever fired. And then came the battle. The serene, cinematic image of two samurai engaging in a graceful one-on-one duel is a powerful fiction. While single combat did occur, especially between champions at the outset of a battle, the reality for most was a chaotic, terrifying, and profoundly impersonal experience. The engagement would begin with a storm. The mounted samurai would charge, not with swords drawn, but with bows bent. The air would fill with a hideous whistling shriek as hundreds, sometimes thousands of arrows were unleashed in great arching volleys. This was not about pinpoint accuracy. It was about creating a killing zone, a rain of steel-tipped death that fell indiscriminately on friend and foe alike. Men and horses would scream and fall, pierced by shafts that could punch through all but the strongest points of their armor. To be caught in one of these arrow storms was to be at the mercy of a lethal lottery. Once the arrow volleys had broken the enemy's formation, the chaos of close-quarters combat would begin. It was a heaving, screaming scrum of men and horses fought in mud and blood, a cacophony of war cries, death screams, and the percussive clang of steel on steel. The primary weapons here were the polearms, the naginata, a long pole with a curved blade, and the yari, a spear. A samurai on foot would use these weapons to stab at the vulnerable points in an enemy's armor, to cripple horses, to create a wall of points to defend against a cavalry charge. The sword was the weapon of last resort, drawn only when a polearm broke or when the fighting became so dense and entangled that there was no room to wield a longer weapon. The fighting was not elegant. It was a brutal, hacking, stabbing affair. A sword strike was aimed at the gaps in the armor, the neck, the armpits, the inner thighs. It was about maiming, crippling, and killing as quickly and efficiently as possible. But the most brutal aspect of samurai warfare, the detail that shatters the myth of the honorable warrior more than any other, was the practice of head-taking, or kubikiri. This was not a barbaric act of rage performed by a few. It was the central, driving purpose of the individual samurai on the battlefield. It was the currency of war. A samurai's performance was not judged by his bravery or his skill in some abstract sense. It was measured by a simple, gruesome arithmetic: the number and rank of the heads he could collect. A common foot soldier's head was worth little. But the head of an enemy samurai, and especially the head of a general or a commander, was a ticket to glory. A valuable head could earn a warrior a promotion in rank, a grant of new lands, a reward of gold or silk, or a commendation from his lord. War, for the samurai, was a gruesome treasure hunt. The process was grimly practical. After felling an enemy, a samurai would drop to his knees beside the body, pull out his short blade, the tanto, and saw through the neck to sever the head. He was vulnerable during this process, and his attendants and foot soldiers would have to form a protective circle around him as he did his grisly work. To prove the head belonged to a warrior of some standing, he would often take a piece of the man's armor or a banner as well. Each head would then be tagged, perhaps with a small wooden placard tied through the top knot, indicating the name of the man who took it. The heads were then gathered, sometimes carried in special bags or nets tied to the samurai's saddle, a bloody, bouncing cargo of human trophies. An ambitious warrior would strive to collect as many as he could, his honor and his future prosperity dependent on the bloody harvest he reaped. This obsession with head-taking led to its own dark economy of battlefield deception. A samurai who had taken the head of a low-ranking warrior might try to make it look more important. He might use dirt to make a young face look older and more grizzled. Or he might apply ink to the teeth, a practice called ohaguro, which was common among high-ranking nobles, to try and pass off a commoner's head as that of a lord. Conversely, a warrior facing certain defeat might do everything in his power to make his own head less valuable to his killer, perhaps by shaving his top knot or defacing his own armor to appear as a commoner. After the battle was won, the most bizarre and chilling ritual of all would take place: the head-viewing ceremony, the kubijiken. The collected heads were not simply counted and discarded. They were prepared for a formal presentation. The heads would be washed clean of blood and dirt. The hair would be carefully combed and re-tied into a proper top knot. For the most important heads, cosmetics might be applied to restore a semblance of life to the dead features. Then, each head would be mounted on a small, individual wooden platter and formally presented to the victorious daimyo and his senior commanders for inspection. Imagine the scene. A great lord seated on a campaign stool, calmly observing as a procession of severed human heads is brought before him. Scribes would be present to record the identity of each head, the name of the warrior who took it, and the reward to be granted. The lord would examine the features, confirm the identity, and pass judgment on its value. It was a cold, bureaucratic process, a corporate results meeting where the product being assessed was human death. This ceremony was the ultimate confirmation of victory, a formal accounting of the enemy's destruction, and the primary means of distributing the spoils of war. The battlefield was not a field of honor. It was a slaughterhouse, and the kubijikan was the final, grim inventory of the butchery. And what of the losers? What of the samurai who survived the battle but were on the defeated side? For the highest-ranking leaders, ritual suicide through seppuku was often the only honorable way out, a final act of defiance and a way to deny the enemy the prize of their head. But for the vast majority of the defeated, there was no such honor. Their fate was often mass execution. Prisoners were a liability. They had to be fed and guarded, and they could live to fight another day. The most expedient solution was simply to kill them. Entire clans could be, and often were, systematically exterminated. This was not limited to the warriors. To prevent any future quest for revenge, the purge would often include all the male relatives of the defeated lord, including his young sons and even infants. Their wives and daughters would be taken as spoils of war, distributed as concubines or servants to the victorious warriors. The concept of mercy to a defeated foe was a luxury that the brutal logic of samurai warfare could rarely afford. The life of the samurai was therefore trapped in an endless, brutal cycle. He was conditioned to kill without remorse, to see his own life as expendable, and to view the battlefield as a marketplace for human heads. His honor, his wealth, and his very survival depended on his proficiency as a butcher. The serene warrior meditating beneath the cherry blossoms is a ghost. The reality was the man on his knees in the mud, soaring at the neck of a fallen enemy, his hands covered in blood, his mind focused only on securing the prize that would allow him to survive until the next battle, the next slaughter, the next grim accounting of the dead. The battle is over, the heads have been counted, the rewards distributed, the promotions granted, and the land reallocated. The bloody field falls silent, left to the crows, the ghosts, and the peasant women who search for their conscripted husbands among the dead. But for the samurai, the brutality did not end when the great wars did. In many ways, it mutated, turning inward, becoming a creeping psychological poison that would contaminate the very soul of the warrior class for the next 2.5 centuries. The final decisive battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600, followed by the consolidation of power by the victor Tokugawa Ieyasu, ushered in an era that would be known to history as the Pax Tokugawa, the Great Peace. For the nation of Japan as a whole, it was a period of unprecedented stability, economic growth, and explosive cultural flourishing. But for the samurai, a class of men bred, conditioned, and trained for the singular purpose of killing, peace was a profound and existential crisis. It was a slow, suffocating death of purpose, and in the vacuum left by the absence of war, it created new and terrible forms of cruelty, both public and private. To comprehend the sheer scale of this crisis, we must first appreciate the world that was shattered at Sekigahara. The preceding century, the Sengoku Jidai, or the age of the country at war, had been a relentless, near-continuous meat grinder. It was a period where a man's life was cheap and a strong sword arm was the only currency that mattered. Society had been militarized from top to bottom. Great warlords, the daimyo, commanded vast armies, and their samurai retainers were not courtiers or administrators. They were full-time, battle-hardened soldiers. Their entire identity, their social standing, their income, and their honor were derived directly from their martial prowess. At the close of this era, Japan was home to hundreds of thousands of these professional killers, perhaps as much as 10% of the male population, a military class far larger than that of any contemporary European nation. When Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man of unparalleled patience, cunning, and strategic genius, finally unified the nation under his rule, he was faced with a monumental problem: what to do with this enormous surplus of violent men. Ieyasu's solution was a masterpiece of social and political engineering, designed to freeze Japanese society in place and ensure his family's dynasty would rule for generations. He established the Tokugawa shogunate, a military government that would rule from the new capital of Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Underneath the shogunate, he implemented the bakuhan system, a rigid hierarchy that balanced the power of the central government, bakufu, with the semi-autonomous domains, Heian, ruled by the local daimyo. But this was no partnership of equals. It was a system of absolute control. Ieyasu and his successors immediately set about defanging the warrior class. They began by systematically confiscating the lands of any daimyo who had opposed them. Hundreds of powerful clans were dissolved with the stroke of a brush. A lord who one day commanded a castle and thousands of loyal samurai could, the next, be a landless exile, his clan's name erased from the official registers. And with the dissolution of each of these clans, thousands of their samurai retainers were instantly cast adrift. They became ronin, literally wave men, masterless warriors tossed on the turbulent sea of a society that no longer had a place for them. The life of a ronin was a waking nightmare of dishonor, desperation, and abject poverty. A samurai's entire identity was predicated on his service to a lord. The bond of loyalty was the spiritual bedrock of his existence. To be masterless was to be socially dead, a ghost at the feast of the Great Peace. Stripped of their stipends of rice, evicted from their homes on castle grounds, these men flocked to the burgeoning cities of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, hoping to find some new purpose, some way to utilize the only skills they possessed. The poverty these men and their families faced was a slow, grinding humiliation. They were forced to sell their possessions one by one in a reverse pilgrimage of their former status. First would go the fine silks and lacquered furniture, then the warhorse, a samurai's trusted partner in battle, would be sold for meat. Then came the armor, often a family heirloom passed down through generations, sold off piece by piece. The helmet, the breastplate, the greaves, until nothing was left. The ultimate shame, the final act of social suicide, was to sell one's swords, the daisho, the matched pair of long and short swords that were the physical embodiment of the samurai's soul. To part with the katana was to admit final defeat, to sever the last link with the warrior identity that had defined one's ancestors for centuries. To avoid this, a ronin might resort to the most desperate measures. He might fashion a fake sword out of bamboo to keep up appearances, his empty scabbard a hollow symbol of his hollow life. Their families bore the brunt of this destitution. A ronin with a wife and children faced an impossible choice. Many, seeing no other way to feed their children, sold their wives or daughters into indentured servitude at tea houses, or, more commonly, into prostitution in the walled pleasure quarters of the cities. This was a personal dishonor so profound, so antithetical to the samurai's role as a protector of his family's name, that it must have been a form of living death, a constant gnawing cancer on the soul. Some ronin attempted to leverage their martial skills. They opened small fencing dojos, kenjutsu schools, but the market was quickly saturated. For every successful teacher, there were 100 starving ones. They would challenge each other to duels, not for honor, but simply to ruin a rival's reputation and steal his few students. Others swallowed their immense pride and became yojimbo, hired bodyguards for wealthy merchants. This was a particularly bitter pill to swallow. The official social hierarchy of the Tokugawa period, the Shino Kosho, placed the samurai at the very top, followed by the farmers, the artisans, and at the very bottom, the merchants. The samurai had been taught to despise the merchant class as parasitic, dishonorable profiteers who dealt in the sordid world of money rather than the noble world of duty and honor. To now be forced to serve and protect such a man for a handful of coins was a constant, daily reminder of how far they had fallen. The most desperate, their moral compass shattered by hunger and shame, slid into outright criminality. They became the very bandits they were once sworn to hunt. They patrolled the great highways like the Tokaido, preying on travelers. They became hired muscle for illegal gambling dens and protection rackets, forming the violent nucleus of what would eventually evolve into the Yakuza. The skills honed for the battlefield were now perverted for petty street violence and extortion. The desperation of the Ronin class was not just a collection of individual tragedies, it became a major social problem for the new shogunate. Throughout the first half of the 17th century, Japan was rocked by a series of Ronin-led uprisings and conspiracies, most famously the Heian Uprising of 1651, a desperate, failed plot to overthrow the shogunate, born from the collective misery of thousands of masterless men. These rebellions were brutally crushed, and the government responded by making it even harder for daimyo to dismiss their samurai, fearing the creation of more disaffected and dangerous men. The figure of the noble, wandering Ronin of cinema, the quiet hero who defends a helpless village, is a romantic fiction. The reality was more often a bitter, dangerous, and starving man, trapped by the rigid pride of his obsolete code in a world that saw him as little more than a violent vagrant. But what of the samurai who kept their masters? What of the ones who were lucky enough to be on the winning side of the new political order? Their fate was its own kind of gilded cage, a different, more insidious form of brutality. Their very function was radically and irrevocably transformed. The warrior became a bureaucrat. The bloody battlefield was replaced by the silent, paper-filled castle town office. The long sword was effectively replaced by the calligraphy brush, the warhorse by the abacus. These men, the grandsons of the fearsome warriors who had carved a domain out of the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai, were now tasked with the mundane and soul-crushing work of administration. Their days were filled with collecting taxes, managing rice yields, keeping meticulous land records, settling petty civil disputes among commoners, and, above all, navigating the stifling, labyrinthine, and politically treacherous etiquette of a peacetime court. Their martial skills, honed over a lifetime, began to atrophy. While training in the martial arts was still a part of a samurai's education, it became increasingly ritualized and disconnected from the reality of combat. It was a performance of warrior identity rather than a preparation for war. They were, in effect, tigers forced to pull plows, their claws clipped, their teeth filed down by the monotonous realities of civil administration. This enforced domestication, this profound dissonance between their inherited warrior identity and their daily bureaucratic function, bred a deep, simmering resentment and a pathological, almost hysterical obsession with status and honor. Since a samurai could no longer prove his worth by taking heads on the battlefield, his honor became a fragile, brittle, and abstract thing, easily offended and demanding constant validation. A minor breach of etiquette, a perceived slight from another samurai in the castle corridors, or an insult from a commoner on the street could provoke an explosion of disproportionate and often lethal violence. And it was here, in the relationship between the pacified samurai and the classes beneath them, that the unique brutality of the peacetime era found its most chilling and infamous expression. This was a privilege codified in law, a concept that lays bare the cold reality of the Tokugawa social order. It was known as kirisute gomen, a phrase that translates literally and terrifyingly as the right to cut down and leave. This was a samurai's legally sanctioned right to kill, on the spot, any member of the lower classes, a farmer, an artisan, or a merchant who had committed a grave insult against him and compromised his honor. The definition of insult was dangerously broad and subject to the samurai's own interpretation. It did not have to be a physical threat. It could be a commoner who failed to show the proper deference, who did not bow low enough or quickly enough as a samurai procession passed. It could be a merchant who used disrespectful language during a business transaction, or who jostled a samurai in a crowded market street. It could be a farmer whose cart accidentally splashed mud on a samurai's kimono. It could be as simple as a direct gaze that was held for a moment too long. If a samurai felt his dignity had been impaired by such an act of bure, discourtesy, he was legally entitled to draw his sword, strike the offender down in the street, and, provided he followed the correct procedure, walk away without fear of punishment. The procedure itself lent the act a veneer of cold legality. After cutting the man down, the samurai was not to flee the scene. He was expected to remain, or at least to report the killing to the nearest government office as soon as possible. He He had to be able to provide a justification for his actions and, ideally, a witness, usually his own attendant or retainer, who could testify to the severity of the commoner's insult. If the authorities were satisfied that the samurai's honor had indeed been grievously offended, the matter would be closed. The commoner's life was officially and legally worth less than the samurai's fleeting sense of public dignity. This was not battlefield justice or self-defense. This was a form of state-sanctioned social terrorism, a legal mechanism designed to enforce the rigid, Neo-Confucian class structure that the Tokugawa shogunate depended upon. The four-tiered system of samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant was the bedrock of the Great Peace, and the ever-present threat of kiri-suit gomen was the violent glue that held it together. It created a society where millions of people lived in a state of constant, low-level fear of the armed men who walked among them. Commoners developed a complex and ingrained etiquette of avoidance and deference. They learned to avert their eyes when a samurai approached, to give them the widest possible berth on the road, to drop to their knees and bow their heads to the ground when a daimyo's procession passed. A parent's most urgent lesson to a child was how to behave in the presence of a samurai, for a moment of youthful carelessness or defiance could lead to an instant and bloody death. While the right was not something that was invoked every single day, to do so would be to invite scrutiny and a reputation for instability. The threat of it was a constant, oppressive psychological presence. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of the samurai's superiority. His two swords were no longer primarily tools of war. They were instruments of class oppression, a constant, visible reminder to the lower orders of their subordinate and precarious place in the world. The deep-seated, institutionalized violence at the core of the samurai identity, now having no legitimate outlet in foreign wars or civil strife, curdled into a brittle arrogance and a capacity for petty, lethal tyranny. It was in this strange, tense environment of peace that the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was truly born. The classic texts that define our modern understanding of Bushido, such as Yamamoto Tsunetomo's Hagakure, were written during this long peace, not during the age of war, and they must be understood in this context. The famous opening line of the Hagakure, the way of the samurai is found in death, is a profoundly nostalgic and reactionary statement. It was written by a man who had never fought in a major battle, a man lamenting the perceived decline and effeminacy of the samurai class in his own time. He looked back with longing to the bloody, purposeful past of his grandfathers and saw the bureaucratic present as a form of decay. This codified, idealized Bushido was not a reflection of how the warriors of the Sengoku Jidai actually behaved. Their actions were more often governed by raw pragmatism and brutal self-interest. Rather, it was a psychological coping mechanism for the peacetime samurai. It was a way for a class of increasingly obsolete and parasitic warriors to justify their continued existence, their legal privileges, and their handsome stipends paid for by the labor of the peasants they ruled over. It was a beautiful, philosophical mask of honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, created to hide the rotting, purposeless core that lay beneath. The peacetime samurai was a man trapped in an impossible position, caught between the idealized ghost of the warrior he was supposed to be, and the frustrating, mundane reality of the administrator he had become, and the immense friction between those two identities created a world of quiet desperation, profound psychological brutality, and the ever-present threat of sudden, casual violence. The brutal equation of peace did not just play out in the public square or in the desperate lives of masterless men. The end of war did not bring tranquility. It simply drove the violence indoors, concentrating the cruelty of the samurai code into a new, more intimate arena, the family. The samurai household of the Tokugawa period was not a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the world. It was a crucible, a miniature domain governed by the same unforgiving principles of absolute authority, rigid hierarchy, and the constant, unspoken threat of violence that had once defined the battlefield. The casualties in this new, silent war were not enemy soldiers, but the samurai's own wife and children, their spirits crushed not by the edge of a sword, but by the suffocating, inescapable weight of a lifetime of domestic oppression. To understand the unique brutality of the samurai family, we must first dispense with another pervasive myth, that of the honor bugeisha, the female warrior. It is an image as compelling and romantic as that of the noble swordsman himself, a woman, clad in armor, wielding a naginata with deadly grace, fighting alongside her husband to defend their castle. Such women certainly existed. The annals of the Sengoku Jidai are filled with stories of formidable warrior women like Tomoe Gozen from the earlier Genpei War, or the historical Miorin, who defended her castle with such ferocity that she became a legend. During the chaotic centuries of civil war, pragmatism often outweighed ideology. A daimyo needed every able body he could find, and the women of samurai families, trained from childhood in the martial arts for the specific purpose of defending the home in their husband's absence, could and did take to the battlefield. But with the coming of the Great Peace, this image was deliberately and systematically destroyed. The Tokugawa shogunate, in its quest to create a stable, predictable, and rigidly hierarchical society, had no use for warrior women. The onabugeisha was a relic of a chaotic past, a symbol of a dangerous female agency that needed to be stamped out. The ideal woman of the new era was not one who could wield a spear, but one who could bow her head in perfect, silent obedience. Marriage for a samurai in this new era was stripped of any lingering notion of partnership or affection. It was a cold, strategic transaction, a political and biological imperative. A samurai did not choose a wife. A wife was chosen for him by his lord or his parents based on the status, wealth, and political connections of her family. The woman herself was little more than a commodity in this negotiation, a vessel whose primary, and indeed sole purpose, was to produce a legitimate male heir to continue her new husband's lineage. Her personal feelings, her intellect, her ambitions, these were not only irrelevant, they were considered dangerous flaws that needed to be suppressed. Her entire being was to be subsumed into the identity of her husband's house. Upon marriage, she ceased to be a daughter of her own family and became, in a very real sense, the property of another. The ideological blueprint for this total subjugation was a text that became one of the most influential and insidious books of the entire Edo period, the Honor Daigaku, or the Great Learning for Women. Though often attributed to the famous Neo-Confucian scholar Kaibara Eken, its true authorship is debated, but its origin is less important than its impact. For generations of samurai women, this small book was their primary educational text, a manual for their own enslavement. It was a rulebook for self-effacement, a guide to erasing one's own identity. Its teachings were not subtle. They were a litany of commands demanding absolute and unquestioning obedience. The core of the Honor Daigaku was the doctrine of the three obediences. A woman, it taught, must first obey her father. As a wife, she must obey her husband with the same unquestioning devotion that a samurai showed his lord. In her old age, if her husband died, she was to obey her eldest son. At no point in her entire life was she ever considered an autonomous individual. Her existence was defined purely by her relationship to the men who controlled her. The text is chilling in its specificity. A woman, it states, has no particular lord. She must look to her husband as her lord and must serve him with all worship and reverence. It continues, the great lifelong duty of a woman is obedience. In her dealings with her husband, both the expression of her countenance and the style of her address should be courteous, humble, and conciliatory. A woman should look on her husband as if he were heaven itself. The book meticulously catalogued a woman's 7 faults, any one of which was grounds for her husband to divorce her instantly. These were disobedience to her father-in-law or mother-in-law, barrenness, the failure to produce a son, lewdness, jealousy, leprosy, or any other foul disease, talking too much or maligning others, and habitual theft. The inclusion of jealousy is particularly cruel. If a husband chose to take a concubine, a common practice, especially if a wife failed to produce a male heir, the wife was not only expected to tolerate it, but to show no sign of resentment or jealousy. She was commanded to treat the concubine's children as her own, to be a friend to the woman who had replaced her in her husband's bed. To show any sign of natural human pain was to commit a fault worthy of expulsion from the household. The wife's daily life was a prison of etiquette and constant scrutiny. She was the first to rise and the last to sleep. She had no personal property. Everything she owned, including the clothes she wore, belonged to her husband. She could not leave the house without his permission. Her correspondence was monitored, but her most formidable and often most cruel warden was not her husband, but her mother-in-law. The matriarch of the household, having endured the same brutal subjugation in her own youth, often perpetuated the cycle of cruelty with relish, wielding her authority over her daughter-in-law with an iron fist. The young wife would be criticized for everything: the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she arranged flowers, the quality of her sewing. It was a relentless campaign of psychological warfare designed to break her spirit and remold her into a perfect, pliant servant of the house. The physical and emotional intimacy of the marriage was also stripped of all affection and reduced to a grim biological duty. The purpose of their union was the heir. The act of procreation was a joyless, ritualized affair, undertaken not out of passion, but out of dynastic obligation. The pressure to produce a son was immense and all-consuming. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was another turn of the screw. If she gave birth to a daughter, it was a disappointment, met with polite condolences rather than celebration. If she failed to conceive at all, or produced only daughters, she was deemed barren, one of the 7 faults. Her husband would then be fully entitled, and indeed expected, to take a concubine to fulfill the duty she had failed to perform. The wife would have to welcome this new woman into her home, a living testament to her own failure. And hanging over her head every single day of her life was the terrifyingly simple mechanism of divorce. A samurai husband did not need to go to a court or provide extensive evidence. All he needed to do was write a short 3.5-line letter of dismissal, the Mikudari-han. This document, dashed off in a few seconds, had the power to utterly destroy a woman's life. It would simply state that she was being divorced and was no longer bound to his house. With that, she would be cast out, forced to return to her own family in the deepest state of public disgrace. She was now used goods, a failed wife. Her prospects for another marriage were virtually zero. Her own family, shamed by her return, might treat her as little more than an unpaid servant. The constant threat of the Mikudari-han was the ultimate tool of control. A single misstep, a perceived flaw, an argument, or simply her husband's boredom could result in her entire world being torn apart. She had absolutely no reciprocal right. A woman could not, under any circumstances, initiate a divorce. Her only escape from an abusive or unbearable marriage was to flee to one of the few designated divorce temples where, if she could endure several years of indentured servitude, she might be granted a release. For most, this was an impossible dream. This brutal system of domestic tyranny naturally extended to the children. The life of a samurai's child was as rigidly controlled and as devoid of warmth as his mother's. The relationship between parent and child was not one of affection, but one of a master and a subordinate. The goal was not to nurture a happy, well-rounded individual, but to forge a perfect component for the family machine. The moment a child was born, its fate was sealed by its gender and its birth order. If the child was a girl, her education would be a mirror of the Onna Daigaku. She would be taught sewing, calligraphy, music, and the complex rituals of the tea ceremony. But these were not for her own enrichment. They were skills to make her a more valuable commodity on the marriage market. Her primary lesson was, like her mother's, the art of self-erasure. She was taught to speak softly, to walk with small, shuffling steps, to never voice an opinion, to smile serenely, and to obey instantly. If the child was a boy, the brutality was of a different, more active kind. The eldest son, the heir, bore a crushing weight of expectation from the moment of his birth. His childhood was not a time of play, but a grueling, relentless training program. While the desensitization rituals of the past, attending executions, meditating in graveyards, became less common in the deep peace of the mid-Tokugawa period, they were replaced by a psychological regimen that was no less harsh. The boy was taught to suppress all emotion, to cry out in pain, to show fear, to express exuberant joy. All were signs of weakness, unworthy of a samurai. He would be subjected to Spartan tests of endurance, forced to go without food, to walk barefoot in the snow, to remain awake for long periods, all to forge a will of steel. His academic education was punishing. focused on the Confucian classics, which reinforced the doctrines of loyalty and filial piety, and the endless, mind-numbing minutiae of courtly protocol and administrative law. His martial arts training was equally severe, designed to instill discipline and a tolerance for pain. He was not being raised, he was being forged, hammered into the shape his family required, any soft, human parts of him beaten away until only the hard shell of duty remained. The fate of the younger sons was perhaps even more tragic. In an era of peace, with no new lands to conquer, there was little for them to do. The law of primogeniture meant that the eldest son inherited everything: the family's rank, its titles, its stipend, and its name. The younger sons inherited nothing. They were a problem, a drain on the family's resources, and a potential source of future rivalry with the heir. A family would go to great lengths to find a place for them. The most common solution was a strategic adoption known as yoshi. A younger son could be adopted into another samurai family that had no male heir of its own, or into a wealthy merchant family to forge a financial alliance. This could be a fortunate outcome, giving him a future as the head of a new household. But it could also be a miserable one, sent as a child to live among strangers, treated as an outsider, his entire life spent in service to a lineage that was not his own. If no suitable adoption could be found, a younger son might be forced into a Buddhist monastery, his life given over to a faith he may not have chosen. The least fortunate simply became permanent, dependent residents in their elder brother's household, living shadows with no role and no future, their entire existence a testament to the accident of their birth. The samurai household, therefore, was not the peaceful, well-ordered institution of official ideology. It was a pressure cooker of suppressed emotions, simmering resentments, and quiet cruelties. Domestic abuse, while not documented in official records, was an implicit reality, sanctioned by the husband's legally absolute authority over his wife and children. Sibling rivalries, especially between the heir and his ambitious younger brothers, could fester into poisonous intrigue. The serene surface of domestic life, with its elegant rituals and polite language, was a thin veneer covering a deep well of human suffering. The Great Peace did not eliminate the brutality of the samurai code. It simply drove it behind closed doors, where its victims were no longer the soldiers of an enemy clan, but the very people the samurai was supposed to protect, his own family. The peace of the Tokugawa era, which had for so long been the defining reality of a samurai's existence, was not destined to last forever. The very system that had frozen Japanese society in place for 2.5 centuries had also made it brittle, isolated, and profoundly vulnerable. And when the outside world finally came knocking, it did so not with a polite inquiry, but with the thunder of cannon fire and the unanswerable logic of industrial power. The arrival of the American black ships in 1853 was a cataclysm, an event that shattered the Great Peace and plunged the samurai class into its final, most convulsive, and ultimately self-destructive phase of brutality. The last decades of the samurai were not a gentle fading into the twilight. They were a blaze of desperate, ideologically fueled violence, a civil war that pitted samurai against samurai in a tragic, bloody struggle for the soul of a nation. The agent of this cataclysm was Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy. He arrived in Edo Bay in July 1853 with a squadron of 4 modern, steam-powered warships, their black hulls and belching smokestacks a terrifying and alien sight to the Japanese, who had only ever known wooden sailing vessels. Perry's mission was simple: to force Japan to open its borders to American trade, by diplomacy if possible, by force if necessary. He carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore, and he made it clear he would not deal with the minor officials sent to meet him. He would only deliver the letter to a representative of the highest authority, and he would return in a year with an even larger fleet for their answer. The threat was not veiled. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the Tokugawa shogunate and a profound public humiliation. For centuries, the shogunate's policy of sakoku, or chained country, had kept the outside world at bay, allowing only minimal, highly controlled trade with the Dutch and Chinese through the port of Nagasaki. Now, a foreign power had steamed, uninvited, into the very heart of their domain and dictated terms at gunpoint. The arrival of the black ships triggered a seismic shock that fractured the samurai class. A ferocious, nationwide debate erupted, cleaving the warrior elite into two main camps. On one side were the pragmatists within the shogunate, the Kaikoku, or Open the Country faction. They understood with a sickening clarity the immense technological and military gap that had opened up between Japan and the West. They knew that to resist the Americans would be national suicide. Their only logical course of action, they argued, was to play for time, to sign the treaties, to open the ports, and to use that time to frantically learn the secrets of Western technology so that Japan could one day meet the foreigners on equal terms. On the other side were the hardline traditionalists, a powerful and vocal faction primarily based in the great outside domains of the South, like Satsuma and Choshu, which had always held a simmering resentment towards Tokugawa rule. Their slogan was Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. The Sono Joy movement was a potent, explosive cocktail of xenophobic rage and political opportunism. It tapped into a deep well of samurai pride, a furious refusal to bow to the demands of foreign barbarians. The shogun, they roared, had failed in his most sacred duty as the military protector of the nation. He had shown weakness and dishonored the country by parleying with the foreigners instead of driving them into the sea. This weakness, they argued, proved that the shogun had usurped the rightful authority of the true sovereign of Japan, the emperor who for centuries had been a powerless, divine figurehead, secluded in his palace in Kyoto. The Sono Joy movement called for the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate and the restoration of direct imperial rule. It was a call to revolution, wrapped in the language of tradition. When the shogunate, bowing to the inevitable, signed the humiliating Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 and subsequent treaties with other Western powers, the country descended into chaos. The next 15 years, known as the Bakumatsu period, were a time of paranoia, intrigue, and bloodshed. The controlled, ritualized cruelty of the long peace gave way to a wave of raw, politically motivated violence. The primary agents of this new brutality were the shishi, the men of high purpose. These were young, lower-ranking, and often masterless samurai, radicalized by the Sono Joy ideology. They were fervent idealists, consumed by a burning patriotism and a righteous fury. They saw themselves as divine instruments, charged with purging the sacred land of Japan of the twin evils of foreign contamination and the corrupt shogunate that enabled it. And their primary tool was the sword. The streets of Kyoto, the ancient imperial capital and the center of the Restoration movement, became a hunting ground. The shishi initiated a campaign of political assassination, a form of terrorism they called tenchu, or heaven's revenge. Their targets were shogunate officials, pro-foreign scholars, and anyone suspected of collaborating with the barbarians. The killings were frequent, brazen, and shockingly brutal. A high-ranking official might be ambushed in his palanquin and hacked to pieces in broad daylight. The assassins would often cut off their victim's head and display it publicly, perhaps on a bridge or at a major crossroads, along with a placard denouncing his crimes against the emperor and the nation. This was a deliberate and gruesome form of political theater, a throwback to the head-taking of the Sengoku Jidai, designed to terrorize their opponents and galvanize their supporters. The most infamous of the assassin cells was led by a man named Kawakami Gensai, one of the four great Hitokiri man-killers of the Bakumatsu. Kawakami was a small, quiet man, but he was a swordsman of terrifying skill, a master of a lightning-fast style of swordsmanship. His most famous victim was Sakuma Shozan, a brilliant and progressive scholar who advocated for opening the country to learn from the West. Kawakami and his followers ambushed Sakuma and cut him down, viewing his advocacy for Western learning as the ultimate act of treason. The assassins of this era were not common criminals. They were celebrated as heroes by the anti-shogunate forces. They were the embodiment of pure, selfless action, men who were willing to become demons to save the soul of the nation. In response to this wave of assassinations, the shogunate unleashed its own enforcers. The most feared of these was the Shinsengumi, the newly selected corps. Recruited from a motley collection of masterless ronin, farmers, and swordsmen from the dojos of Edo, the Shinsengumi were essentially a shogunate-sanctioned death squad, given license to hunt down and eliminate the Sono-Joy radicals in Kyoto. They were every bit as ruthless and skilled as the assassins they hunted. Led by charismatic and brutal commanders like Kondo Isami and the cold, calculating Hijikata Toshizo, the Shinsengumi became a force of terror in the capital. Their distinctive light blue haori coats, with white mountain peak patterns on the sleeves, became a symbol of death for the revolutionary Shishi. The Shinsengumi operated outside the normal bounds of the law. They conducted raids, spied on suspected traitors, and tortured prisoners for information. Their internal code was famously draconian. Desertion, cowardice, or raising private funds were all punishable by a swift order to commit seppuku. Their most legendary moment came in 1864, during the Ikadaya incident. Having tortured a captured Shishi and learned of a plot to set fire to Kyoto and assassinate a key shogunate official, a small group of Shinsengumi, led by Kondo, launched a surprise raid on the Ikadaya Inn, where the conspirators were meeting. What followed was a 2-hour slaughter in the dark, cramped rooms and corridors of the inn. The Shinsengumi, though heavily outnumbered, were superior swordsmen and fought with a cold, desperate ferocity. They killed or captured nearly all of the revolutionary leaders present, a devastating blow to the Sono-Joy movement from which it never fully recovered. The Ikadaya incident was a microcosm of the Bakumatsu era, a savage, close-quarters bloodbath between two groups of samurai, both claiming to be fighting for the good of Japan, butchering each other in the name of loyalty. The violence was not confined to the back alleys of Kyoto. As the political situation deteriorated, the great domains of Satsuma and Choshu, the heartlands of the anti-shogunate movement, openly went to war with the shogunate. This was a new kind of warfare, a brutal collision of the old and the new. A samurai in traditional armor, armed with his family's ancestral sword, might find himself charging into the sights of a modern rifle or facing a devastating volley from a Gatling gun. The ancient rituals of single combat and glorious charges were rendered obsolete and suicidal in the face of industrial-era firepower. The domains that adopted Western military tactics and technology, like Choshu with its mixed-class rifle militias, consistently defeated the more traditional armies of the shogunate. The very skills that had defined the samurai for 1,000 years, mastery of the horse, the bow, and the sword, were now tragically, pitifully useless. The final bloody act came with the Boshin War, which began in 1868. The forces of the Imperial Restoration, led by Satsuma and Choshu, marched on the shogunate armies. The war was short but brutal. At the key battle of Toba-Fushimi, the outnumbered but modern-equipped imperial forces shattered the larger shogunate army. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, surrendered, and the Emperor Meiji was formally restored to power, marking the end of more than 260 years of Tokugawa rule and nearly 700 years of military government in Japan. The era of the samurai was officially over. But a warrior does not simply lay down his sword and his identity because a new government has been declared. The Meiji Restoration ushered in a period of radical, dizzying modernization. The new government, led by the very same samurai from Satsuma and Choshu who had championed the "expel the barbarian" movement, now ironically embraced a policy of frantic, full-scale westernization under the slogan Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the military. They realized that the only way to avoid being colonized by the West was to become a Western-style industrial and military power themselves. And in this new Japan, there was no place for a privileged, hereditary warrior class. The final, most brutal blows to the samurai were not delivered on the battlefield, but by a series of imperial edicts. In 1871, the feudal domains were abolished and replaced with modern prefectures. In 1873, a universal conscript army, modelled on the Prussian system, was established. This was a fatal blow. It meant that any common farmer could now be a soldier, destroying the samurai's ancient monopoly on violence. Then came the ultimate humiliation. In 1876, the government issued the Haiterei Edict, which forbade all but former lords, police, and military personnel from wearing swords in public. The daisho, the soul of the samurai, was now illegal. At the same time, their hereditary rice stipends were converted into government bonds, which quickly lost their value due to inflation, plunging thousands of samurai families into poverty. In the space of less than a decade, the samurai were stripped of their lands, their income, their social status, their monopoly on violence, and the very symbol of their identity. They had been made obsolete by the very revolution they had helped to create. This final, systemic dismantling of their entire world led to one last tragic spasm of samurai violence, the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. It was led by the most famous and revered samurai of the age, Saigo Takamori. Saigo was a hero of the Meiji Restoration, a key leader from Satsuma who had helped overthrow the shogunate. But he was also a man deeply troubled by the radical changes he saw sweeping across Japan. He watched with dismay as the traditions and values of the samurai were cast aside. He became a hero to the thousands of disaffected, impoverished samurai who felt betrayed by the new government. When the government refused his plan to launch an invasion of Korea, a plan he saw as a way to give the samurai a noble purpose once more, he resigned his position and returned to his home domain of Satsuma, where he established private military academies that taught the traditional samurai arts. These academies became a magnet for discontented samurai from all over Japan. Tensions with the central government finally exploded, and Saigo, with a heavy heart, found himself leading a rebellion he knew was doomed. He marched out of Satsuma at the head of an army of around 30,000 samurai, armed mostly with swords and traditional firearms. They were met by the new Imperial Japanese Army, a conscript force of commoners armed with modern rifles, artillery, and Gatling guns. The result was a foregone conclusion. Saigo's samurai fought with a courage and suicidal bravery that stunned their opponents, but courage was no match for industrial firepower. They were systematically ground down over a period of several months. The final stand came at the Battle of Shiroyama. Saigo, badly wounded, was left with only a few hundred loyal samurai. Surrounded and facing annihilation, he committed seppuku, assisted by his most trusted lieutenant, who then cut off Saigo's head and hid it to prevent it from being taken as a trophy by the enemy. The last of his followers then drew their swords and launched a final, hopeless charge into the guns of the Imperial Army, where they were annihilated. The Satsuma Rebellion was the last stand of the samurai class, a final, bloody act of defiance against the unstoppable tide of modernity. It was the end of a 1,000-year history, a history that began with the bow and ended in a hail of machine gun fire. The brutality that had forged the samurai, that had sustained them through centuries of war and peace, had in the end consumed them completely. The last samurai charge at Shiroyama was over. The smoke had cleared, the echoes of the Gatling guns had faded, and the body of Saigo Takamori, the final icon of a defunct age, lay cold. The Meiji government had successfully crushed the last armed resistance to its modernizing agenda. But the death of the samurai as a political and military force was not the end of their story. In many ways, it was a new beginning. For the brutality of the samurai code, a force too powerful and too deeply embedded in the national psyche to simply vanish with the men who wielded the swords, did not die. It mutated, it shed its feudal skin, put on a modern military uniform, and was reborn on a terrifying, national scale. The soul of the samurai, with its demand for absolute loyalty, its glorification of death, and its contempt for surrender, was methodically repurposed by the architects of modern Japan. It was transformed from the code of an elite warrior class into the ideology of an entire nation, setting Japan on a catastrophic path that would lead to imperial conquest, unimaginable atrocities, and a final apocalyptic confrontation with the very Western powers it had once sought to emulate. The leaders of the new Meiji government, men like Ito Hirobumi, Yamagata Aritomo, and Okubo Toshimichi, were, for the most part, former samurai themselves. They had led the revolution that destroyed their own class, not out of a desire for democracy or individual liberty, but out of a cold, pragmatic understanding of national survival. They knew that to avoid the fate of China, which had been carved up and humiliated by the Western powers, Japan had to become a predator, not a victim. And to do this, they needed to create a new kind of Japanese citizen, one with the unwavering loyalty, the iron discipline, and the fanatical devotion to the state that had once been the sole province of the samurai. They embarked on a sweeping project of social engineering, a deliberate and systematic effort to instill a modernized version of the samurai spirit into every man, woman, and child in Japan. The first and most crucial instrument of this transformation was the new Imperial Japanese Army. The conscription law of 1873 was more than just a military reform, it was a revolutionary social tool. For the first time, the sons of peasants, merchants, and artisans were not only allowed but required to bear arms. This was a radical departure from the rigid class structure of the Tokugawa era. But the new army was not to be an army of citizens in the Western sense. It was to be an army of modern-day samurai, their personal loyalties transferred from a feudal lord, a daimyo, to a new, infinitely more powerful master, the emperor. The Emperor Meiji, who had been a powerless symbol for centuries, was elevated to the status of a living god, the divine father of the Japanese family state. An intense cult of personality was constructed around him. He was presented as the direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, the sacred and inviolable embodiment of the nation itself. This was a brilliant political move. It provided a single, unchallengeable focus for national loyalty, replacing the hundreds of feudal loyalties of the past. The architects of Meiji Japan then directly fused this new emperor worship with the old samurai code. In 1882, the emperor issued the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. This document, which became the sacred text of the Japanese military, was required reading for every soldier. It was, in essence, a modernized version of Bushido. It demanded 5 key virtues: absolute loyalty to the emperor, absolute obedience to superior officers, courage, righteousness, and simplicity. It explicitly warned soldiers against being seduced by popular theories or getting involved in politics, demanding that their entire being be dedicated to their duty to the emperor. A soldier's death in battle was not a tragedy. It was the ultimate fulfillment of his duty, the highest honor he could achieve, a sacrifice made directly to a divine sovereign. The training within the new army was a brutal reflection of this ideology. The raw peasant recruits were subjected to a process of systematic dehumanization designed to beat their old identities out of them and forge them into obedient instruments of the imperial will. The methods were drawn directly from the harshest traditions of samurai training. Physical abuse was not just common, it was institutionalized. Officers and non-commissioned officers would routinely and savagely beat the men under their command for the slightest infraction, a practice seen as a necessary tool for forging discipline and obedience. This created a vicious cycle of abuse, as the brutalized recruits would, in turn, brutalize the newer recruits who came after them. The individual was nothing. The unit, the army, and the emperor were everything. This system produced soldiers of incredible toughness and discipline, but it also created men who were conditioned to accept and inflict extreme violence without question, men whose capacity for empathy had been deliberately and systematically destroyed. The second great instrument of this national indoctrination was the public education system. In 1890, the government issued another sacred text, the Imperial Rescript on Education, which was distributed to every school in Japan. A portrait of the emperor was also sent to each school, and students were required to bow to it daily. The Rescript on Education became the moral foundation of the entire school system. It preached a gospel of patriotic duty, filial piety, and above all, the willingness to offer yourselves courageously to the state in times of crisis. History textbooks were rewritten to emphasize the divine origins of the emperor and the unique superior nature of the Japanese spirit, the Yamato Damashi. The samurai of old were presented not as feudal warriors loyal to their individual lords, but as selfless paragons of loyalty to the emperor, their stories twisted into patriotic fables. Children learned from their earliest days that their ultimate purpose in life was to serve the emperor and the nation, and that the greatest glory was to die for this cause. This nationalistic, militaristic ideology, this mass-produced Bushido, soon demanded an outlet. A nation that defines itself by its warrior spirit cannot remain at peace for long. Japan's new, modern army, forged in the crucible of this samurai-inspired code, was eager to test its strength. The first victim was China. In 1894, Japan went to war with its ancient neighbor over influence in Korea. To the shock of the world, the small, newly modernized nation of Japan inflicted a swift and humiliating defeat on the vast, lumbering Chinese empire. The victory was total. Japan gained control of Taiwan and a sphere of influence in Korea and announced its arrival as a new imperial power on the world stage. The brutality of the new Japanese army was on full display. In the captured city of Port Arthur, Japanese soldiers, enraged by the discovery of the mutilated bodies of some of their comrades, went on a rampage, slaughtering thousands of Chinese prisoners of war and civilians in what became known as the Port Arthur Massacre. The samurai's historical contempt for the defeated, his belief that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, had now been translated into the actions of a modern national army. The next great test came against a Western power. From 1904 to 1905, Japan fought a war with the Russian Empire, again over competing imperial interests in Manchuria and Korea. Once again, the world watched in stunned disbelief as the little Japanese defeated the mighty Russian bear on both land and sea. The Japanese soldiers, imbued with the Bushido spirit, displayed a fanatical, almost suicidal courage. They launched human wave attacks against Russian machine gun positions, marching stoically into a hail of bullets. The siege of Port Arthur became a legend of self-sacrifice, with tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers dying in desperate charges against fortified positions. At the Great Naval Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese fleet, under the command of Admiral Togo Heihachiro, annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The Russo-Japanese War was a watershed moment. It was the first time in the modern era that a non-Western nation had defeated a major European power. It supercharged Japanese nationalism and seemed to provide definitive proof of the superiority of their warrior spirit. But the victories came at a terrible cost, and they embedded the worst aspects of the samurai code even more deeply into the military's DNA. The glorification of the suicidal banzai charge, the belief that Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage, and the absolute refusal to surrender became central tenets of military doctrine. The soldier who was captured alive was considered to have brought an unbearable shame upon himself, his family, and his nation. There was no concept of being an honorable prisoner of war. To be captured was to be less than human, a ghost who had failed in his duty to die. This belief would have horrifying consequences in the decades to come, as it led Japanese soldiers to view the enemy soldiers who surrendered to them with a profound and lethal contempt. By the 1920s and 1930s, the Japanese government was increasingly dominated by the military. The civilian politicians who urged caution and diplomacy were pushed aside, often through assassination by ultra-nationalist secret societies. The army, particularly the Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria, began to act as a state within a state, pursuing its own aggressive, expansionist agenda without the consent of the government in Tokyo. In 1931, they staged the Mukden Incident, a fake act of sabotage that they used as a pretext to invade and conquer all of Manchuria, which they transformed into the puppet state of Manchukuo. When the League of Nations condemned the action, Japan simply walked out, isolating itself from the international community and accelerating its descent into military dictatorship. This was the prelude to the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in earnest in 1937. It was here that the full, unrestrained brutality of the modernized samurai spirit was unleashed upon the world. The war in China was a war of annihilation, characterized by a level of cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. The Japanese Imperial Army, viewing the Chinese as a racially and culturally inferior people, engaged in a campaign of systematic terror. The most infamous episode was the rape of Nanking. In late 1937, after capturing the Chinese capital, Japanese soldiers went on a 6-week orgy of murder, rape, arson, and looting. They slaughtered hundreds of thousands of disarmed Chinese soldiers and unarmed civilians. Men were used for bayonet practice, beheaded in killing contests, or burned alive. Tens of thousands of women, from young girls to elderly grandmothers, were subjected to horrific sexual violence before being murdered. The city was turned into a vision of hell on earth. The atrocities at Nanking were not an isolated incident. They were part of a pattern of behavior repeated across China. The army's three-alls policy, Sankosakusen, or kill all, burn all, loot all, was a deliberate strategy of scorched earth warfare designed to break the will of the Chinese resistance. Medical experiments, including live vivisections without anesthesia, were carried out on prisoners by the infamous Unit 731. The samurai's historic capacity for ruthlessness, his desensitization to violence, and his absolute loyalty to a higher authority had been successfully scaled up and weaponized by a modern industrial state. The result was a Holocaust. The final act of this national tragedy began with the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and the entry of Japan into the Second World War. The early stages of the war in the Pacific were a string of stunning Japanese victories, seemingly confirming the superiority of their warrior creed. But the war that followed was one of attrition, a war that Japan, with its limited resources, could never hope to win against the industrial might of the United States. And as the tide of the war turned, the brutality of the samurai code reached its final suicidal apotheosis. Faced with inevitable defeat, the Japanese military doubled down on the death cult at its core. Every island became a fortress to be defended to the last man. Surrender was not an option. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, Japanese soldiers would not only fight to the death, they would often force the local civilians to commit mass suicide rather than fall into American hands. Mothers were forced to kill their own children before throwing themselves off cliffs. And then came the kamikaze. The Divine Wind pilots were the ultimate embodiment of the samurai spirit, young men who would fly their planes loaded with explosives directly into American warships. It was seppuku on a technological scale, a final, desperate act of self-immolation. It was a strategy born from a military culture that valued death more than life and saw no honor in survival. The samurai, in his final, terrifying incarnation, had turned the entire nation into his kaishakunin, his assistant in a ritual of national suicide. The path that began with the provincial warrior serving his local lord had ended here, in a fireball of burning fuel and shattered steel in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a final, brutal testament to a code that knew how to die but had forgotten how to live. The last kamikaze pilot had plunged into the sea. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been erased from the earth by a power that beggared the imagination, a force that rendered the samurai's sword and even the soldier's rifle tragically, absurdly obsolete. The emperor's voice, a sound never before heard by his subjects, had crackled over the radio, announcing the unthinkable: surrender. The war was over. And with its end came the final, most profound, and perhaps most brutal stage in the long life of the samurai spirit. Its forced death and its strange, ghostly afterlife in the consciousness of a nation utterly defeated, humiliated, and remade. The American occupation of Japan was not just a military or political project, it was a psychological one. It was an attempt to perform a national exorcism, to root out the militaristic, emperor-worshipping, death-glorifying ideology that had led to the Pacific War, an ideology that was, at its core, the mass-produced ghost of the samurai. The arrival of the American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur in 1945 was a moment of profound shock and terror for the Japanese people. They had been taught their entire lives that the Americans were white devils, barbarians who would rape the women and slaughter the men. Instead, they were met not with a wave of vengeful violence, but with a methodical, bureaucratic, and shockingly powerful force of transformation. MacArthur, in his role as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, SCAP, became the de facto shogun of Japan, wielding a power more absolute than any Tokugawa ruler had ever dreamed of. And his mission, as he saw it, was to tear down the entire ideological structure of Imperial Japan and rebuild it in the image of Western democracy. This meant a direct assault on the very foundations of the samurai legacy. The first step was demilitarization. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, the proud inheritors of the samurai tradition, were completely and permanently dissolved. Millions of soldiers were disarmed and sent home, their swords confiscated, their uniforms stripped away. The great naval bases were dismantled, the war industries repurposed. The government ministries that had prosecuted the war, the Army Ministry, the Navy Ministry, were abolished. This was not just a practical measure, it was a symbolic one. It was a statement that the era of Japanese military power, the era of Fukoku Kyohei that had begun with the Meiji Restoration, was over. The nation's teeth were being pulled, its claws clipped. The second, and far more complex step was the dismantling of the state ideology. This began with the most powerful symbol of all, the emperor. MacArthur made a brilliant and controversial decision. Instead of trying Hirohito as a war criminal, which many of the Allies demanded, he chose to keep him on the throne, but to fundamentally transform his role. He would be stripped of his divinity and remade as a mortal, constitutional monarch, a symbol of the state with no political power. This culminated in the Emperor's Humanity Declaration of January 1st, 1946. In a formal rescript, Hirohito publicly renounced the false conception that the Emperor is divine and that the Japanese people are superior to other races. For a nation that had been taught for generations to worship the Emperor as a living god, this was a moment of profound psychological dislocation. The central pillar of their entire worldview had been deliberately and publicly shattered by the man himself, acting under the direction of a foreign shogun. The samurai's ultimate lord had declared himself to be merely a man. Simultaneously, SCAP launched a purge of the education system. The imperial rescript on education was rescinded. Textbooks were rewritten. The teaching of martial arts, kendo and judo was banned from schools as a dangerous vessel of militaristic values. The cult of the state, the glorification of war, and the fables of samurai loyalty were replaced by lessons on democracy, individual rights, and peace. State Shinto, the government-enforced religion that had been used to buttress the emperor cult, was abolished, creating for the first time a genuine separation of church and state. The entire apparatus of indoctrination that had so effectively turned a nation of farmers and merchants into a nation of modern samurai was being systematically taken apart, piece by piece. The most dramatic act of this ideological purgation was the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, commonly known as the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. Here, Japan's top military and political leaders, the men who had been the daimyo of the modern era, were put on public trial for war crimes. Men like Hideki Tojo, the wartime prime minister, were accused of planning and waging aggressive war and of being responsible for the countless atrocities committed by the troops under their command. The trials were a brutal and humiliating public spectacle. The leaders who had demanded absolute loyalty and sacrifice from their people were now revealed to the world as the architects of a criminal enterprise. The samurai concept of taking responsibility through seppuku was replaced by the Western legal concept of accountability before a court of law. When Tojo and 6 others were sentenced to death and hanged, it was the final, ignominious end to the warrior elite that had dominated Japan for nearly a millennium. They were not allowed an honorable, ritualized death. They were executed as common criminals. But how does one kill a ghost? An army can be disbanded, an emperor can be demoted, and a textbook can be rewritten, but a spirit, an idea, is a much harder thing to destroy. As Japan began its stunning post-war economic recovery, the economic miracle that transformed it from a smoldering ruin into a global industrial powerhouse, the ghost of the samurai found a new home. It did not return to the battlefield or the government ministry. It moved into the corporate boardroom. The Japanese corporation of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s became a bizarre and highly effective echo of the old feudal domain. The employee, the salaryman, became the new samurai. His loyalty to his company, be it Sony, Toyota, or Mitsubishi, was absolute and lifelong. Just as a samurai was born into a domain and served it until death, A salaryman would typically join a company straight out of university and stay there for his entire career, a system known as lifetime employment. The company, in turn, acted like a benevolent but demanding feudal lord. It provided for all the employees' needs: housing, healthcare, social clubs, and a secure pension. But in return, it demanded his total and utter devotion. The salaryman's life revolved around the company. He would work brutally long hours, often followed by mandatory after-work drinking sessions with colleagues and bosses to build group cohesion. He would sing the company song with patriotic fervor. His personal identity was subsumed into his corporate one. To be a Sony man was a statement of being, just as being a Satsuma man had been centuries before. The old samurai virtues were subtly repurposed for a new economic war. Loyalty, discipline, group harmony, WA, and selfless dedication to the collective were the qualities of the ideal corporate warrior. The individual who put his own needs or his family's needs before the needs of the company was viewed with suspicion, a modern-day ronin. The fierce competition between Japanese companies in the global marketplace was a sublimated form of the old clan rivalries. The goal was no longer to take territory by force of arms, but to take market share by force of industrial production. It was, in its own way, a brilliantly successful adaptation, channeling the immense social energy of the samurai code away from military self-destruction and into productive economic conquest. And then, as the 20th century drew to a close, the samurai spirit found another strange afterlife, this time in popular culture, both in Japan and across the globe. The brutal, complex, and often cruel history of the samurai was sandblasted, simplified, and romanticized into a compelling global brand. The samurai became a powerful symbol of cool, stoic masculinity, Zen wisdom, and martial prowess. The films of Akira Kurosawa, particularly Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, presented a compelling, humanistic yet ultimately romantic vision of the warrior class that captured the imagination of the world. This, in turn, influenced a generation of Western filmmakers, leading to films like Star Wars, where the Jedi Knights are essentially space samurai, complete with laser swords, a mystical force, and a master-apprentice relationship. The samurai became a cultural export, a source of soft power for a nation that had been stripped of its hard power. In Japan itself, this romanticization took on a different, more complex flavor. The samurai became a symbol of a lost, pure Japanese identity, a nostalgic connection to a time before the humiliations of defeat and the perceived dilutions of westernization. Manga, anime, and video games are filled with samurai characters, almost always presented as heroes of immense skill and noble purpose. The brutal realities of head-taking, class oppression, and domestic tyranny are conveniently forgotten, replaced by a sanitized and thrilling fantasy of honor and swordplay. The Shinsengumi, once a feared shogunate death squad, are now often portrayed as handsome, tragic young heroes, the boy band of the Bakumatsu. This cultural rehabilitation serves a deep psychological need, allowing a nation to reclaim a powerful part of its history while quietly editing out the parts that are too brutal or too uncomfortable to confront directly. So where does this leave the samurai today? He is a paradox, a figure of profound contradiction. He is simultaneously a symbol of the dangerous, ultranationalist militarism that led Japan to ruin, and a symbol of a noble, stoic, and uniquely Japanese spirit. He is a historical figure whose reality was one of almost unimaginable brutality, and a fictional character who embodies some of our most cherished ideals of honor and self-sacrifice. He is dead, his class abolished, his castles turned into museums, his swords hung on walls, and yet he is everywhere. In the relentless work ethic of a Tokyo office, in the fluid grace of a kendo master, in the quiet discipline of a Zen monastery, and on a million movie screens and video game consoles around the world. He is a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. The brutality of his life, a force that shaped a nation for 1,000 years, may have been buried, but its echoes are still all around us, a quiet, persistent whisper beneath the noise of the modern world, a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It isn't even past. We have traced the shadow of the samurai from his bloody birth in the lawless provinces to his last suicidal charge into the teeth of modern machine guns. We have watched his spirit, a strange and potent ghost, possess the body of a modern nation-state, driving it to imperial glory and then to apocalyptic ruin. We have seen that same spirit, exorcised by defeat, find a strange afterlife in the corporate boardroom and on the silver screen. But to truly understand the depth of the brutality that defined the samurai, to grasp the sheer, unforgiving pressure that shaped him, we must look beyond the battlefield, beyond the political intrigues, beyond the grand sweep of history. We must look at the steel itself. For the samurai's sword, the katana, was not merely a weapon in his hands. It was a physical manifestation of his code, an object of almost mystical reverence, and the product of a process so demanding, so spiritually charged, and so steeped in a philosophy of uncompromising perfection that it stands as the final, most chilling, and most eloquent metaphor for the brutal forging of the samurai himself. The creation of a true samurai sword was not a craft, it was a religious rite, an act of metallurgical prayer. The swordsmith, the kaji, was not seen as a mere artisan or blacksmith. He was a master of secrets, a priest of the fire god, an alchemist who could command the elemental spirits of earth, fire, water, and air to transmute crude dark sand into a living soul of steel. His social standing reflected this. The greatest smiths, men like the legendary Goro Nudo Masamune or the infamous Sengo Muramasa, were revered figures, sometimes granted samurai rank themselves, their names whispered with an awe usually reserved for great lords or Buddhist saints. Their forge, the Hizukuri, was not a workshop, it was a shrine, a sanctum sanctorum. Before beginning the sacred and arduous process of creating a blade, the smith would undergo a period of intense ritual purification. He would perform misogi, a Shinto rite of cleansing himself with buckets of cold, bracing water, washing away the spiritual grime of the mundane world. He would abstain from alcohol, from meat, and from the company of women. He would don the white robes of a Shinto priest, a symbol of purity, and hang a thick, plaited rope of rice straw, a shimenawa, across the entrance to his forge. This sacred rope, adorned with white paper streamers, designated the space within as consecrated ground, a place where the kami, the divine spirits, were invited to descend and oversee the work, and where all negative influences, all bad luck, and all spiritual impurities were strictly forbidden to enter. The process he was about to begin was a battle, a spiritual contest between his own will and the chaotic, stubborn nature of the metal, and only a state of absolute physical, mental, and spiritual purity would grant him the clarity and strength to prevail. The journey of the sword began in the earth itself with a special type of iron sand called satetsu. Japan, a land of volcanic fury, is poor in high-quality iron ore, the raw material for European steel. This geological poverty forced Japanese smiths, out of sheer necessity, to develop a far more complex and ingenious method of steel production. The satetsu was painstakingly gathered from specific riverbeds or coastal dunes, a black, heavy sand rich in iron oxide. This sand was then transported to the heart of the steel-making process, the tatara, a monstrous clay furnace that was itself a living entity. The tatara was not a permanent structure. It was built anew for each smelt. A massive, trough-like structure made of special clay bricks, sometimes 10 feet long and 4 feet high. Its construction was a communal effort, its design perfected over centuries. The master of this colossal beast was the Mirage, a figure of immense respect and knowledge who directed the entire, grueling smelting process. For 3 days and 3 nights, the tatara would be fed without pause. A team of smiths would work in relentless shifts, a rhythmic, exhausting ballet of labor. They would feed the furnace's roaring mouth with a precise diet of charcoal and iron sand, their movements a kind of chant, their faces illuminated by the infernal glow. They operated the massive bellows, the fuigo, pumping a constant stream of air into the furnace's heart, raising the temperature to over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The Tatara would roar and groan, a living dragon consuming earth and wood, its breath a column of fire and smoke that lit up the night sky. After 72 hours of continuous, hellish labor, the process was complete. The clay walls of the Tatara would be broken down to reveal its offspring, a massive, irregular bloom of crude metal called the kira, weighing several tons. This kira was not steel. It was a heterogeneous mass, a metallic sponge containing iron and steel of wildly varying carbon content. Now the swordsmith's true genius came into play. The kira was shattered into thousands of pieces, and the smith would meticulously read the fragments. He would judge them by their color, by their crystalline fracture patterns, by the sound they made when struck. He was searching for the most precious component, the high-carbon steel known as tamahagane, or jewel steel. These pieces, rough and unassuming to the untrained eye, were the soul of the future blade, and only the smith's intimate, almost mystical connection with his materials allowed him to find them. Now, in the sacred quiet of his own forge, the smith would begin the critical process of purification and lamination, the forging and folding that gives the Japanese sword its legendary properties. He would take the selected pieces of tamahagane, heat them until they glowed the brilliant yellow-orange of the rising sun, and hammer them together on his anvil, welding them into a single rough billet. He would then sprinkle the billet with a flux of rice straw, ash and clay to prevent oxidation and help the layers weld together. And then he would fold it. Using a chisel, he would cut a deep notch in the middle of the glowing billet and with a deft hammer blow, fold it back on itself. Then he would hammer it relentlessly, drawing it out, welding the two layers into one seamless whole. Then he would do it again and again and again. This process, the Orikeshi Tanran, was repeated on average 12 to 15 times. It was an act of brutal, rhythmic purification. With each fold, the steel was stretched, the carbon distributed more evenly, and the impurities, the slag, were literally hammered out of the metal, exploding from the billet in a shower of brilliant sparks that the smith saw as departing evil spirits. The number of layers created was exponential. After 10 folds, the blade contained 1,024 layers. After 15 folds, it contained 32,768 layers. This immense number of laminations created the beautiful, subtle, wood grain pattern, the hada or skin, visible on the surface of a finished blade. This was the visible history of its violent birth, a testament to the immense labor that had gone into its creation. But its purpose was not aesthetic. The thousands of microscopic layers created a steel structure that was incredibly resilient, capable of resisting the propagation of cracks and preventing the blade from snapping under the immense stress of combat. This process demanded a level of skill that bordered on the supernatural. The smith had to control the temperature of the forge by eye alone, judging the heat of the metal by its color with an accuracy of a few degrees. Every hammer blow had to be precise, shaping the steel, compressing the layers, driving out the slag. It was a physically punishing, mentally exhausting dance with fire and iron, a percussive mantra that could last for days on end. But the true genius of the Japanese sword, the secret that made it arguably the finest cutting weapon ever created, was that it was not one single piece of steel. It was a sophisticated composite blade, a masterpiece of laminated engineering. The high-carbon folded tamahagane was incredibly hard and could hold a razor-sharp edge, but it was also brittle. A sword made entirely of this material would shatter on impact with armor or another sword, so the smith would forge a core of softer, low-carbon, less folded steel, which was more flexible and shock-absorbent. He would then forge-weld the hard, high-carbon skin steel, the kawagane, around this soft core steel, the shingane. The most common construction, kobuse, involved wrapping the hard steel completely around a soft core, but there were many other, more complex methods. Sanmai involved sandwiching a hard steel core between two softer steel sides. Shihozume involved a four-piece construction with a hard edge, a medium hard back, and two soft sides. This created a blade with a brutally hard cutting edge, but with a softer, more pliable body that could absorb the shock of a parry without shattering. It was the perfect union of opposites: hardness and flexibility, beauty and lethality, a physical paradox in steel that mirrored the samurai's own need to be unyielding in his duty, yet adaptable in his tactics. The final stage of the forging was the creation of the hamon, the distinctive, cloud-like temper line that is the sword's most recognizable feature. This was the moment the sword was truly born, the moment its soul was sealed in fire and water. The swordsmith would painstakingly coat the entire blade in a secret mixture of clay, charcoal powder, and other ingredients, a recipe passed down through generations known as yakibatsuchi. He would apply a thick, insulating layer to the spine and sides of the blade, and a much thinner layer along the keen cutting edge. Then, using a small bamboo spatula, he would carefully scrape away parts of the thin clay along the edge, creating an intricate, unique pattern that would become his signature. These patterns had names that evoked the natural world: Suguha, a straight line; Gunome, regular waves; Notare, gentle, rolling waves; and Choji, resembling cloves of lilac. The blade, now cloaked in its earthen shroud, was then heated one last time, with the smith watching the color of the exposed edge with an almost unbearable intensity, waiting for it to reach the precise temperature of the moon in a winter sky. At the perfect, psychic moment, known only to him, he would lift the glowing blade from the forge and plunge it, edge first, into a trough of water. This was the water quenching, the yaki-aya. It was the moment of greatest risk and greatest magic. The sudden, extreme cooling of the thin clayed edge transformed its steel into an incredibly hard, crystalline structure called martensite. The thick layer of clay on the spine and body caused it to cool much more slowly, creating a softer, more flexible steel structure called pearlite. This differential hardening is what created the visible hamon, the boundary between the two steel types. This process was also incredibly violent. The edge steel, in its transformation, expanded more than the spine steel, forcing the blade to curve naturally into its iconic, graceful shape. But the internal stresses on the steel were immense. The smith might have worked for weeks on a single blade, only to have it crack with a sickening ping, warp beyond repair, or shatter completely in the water. It is said that for every perfect blade a master smith created, several others would fail at this final, critical moment, a heartbreaking testament to the unforgiving, brutal nature of perfection. But even after the blade emerged, curved and hardened from its fiery baptism, it was not yet a sword. It was a rough, dark, scale-covered object, its inner beauty still hidden. Now it was handed over to another master craftsman, the polisher, the togishi. The polisher's job was a slow, meditative, and equally demanding one. He would spend weeks, sometimes months, painstakingly rubbing the blade with a series of progressively finer waterstones, some so small they were manipulated with the fingertips alone. This was not sharpening in the conventional sense. It was a slow, sculptural process of revealing the inner life of the steel. With each finer stone, another layer of the sword's soul was revealed. First the overall shape, then the geometric lines of the tip, then the wood-grain pattern of the haida, and finally, the intricate, crystalline structures of the hamon, the star-like nai and the misty nioi. The polisher was not a sharpener. He was an art critic, an editor, a priest performing the final rites that would allow the sword's spirit to be seen by the world. His work was as critical as the smith's, for a poor Polish could hide the beauty of a great blade forever. Only then was the finished, gleaming blade passed to a host of other artisans to be mounted in its koshirai, the furniture that would make it a functional weapon. This was itself a world of high art. The guard, tsuba, the collar, fuchi, the pommel cap, kashira, and the small hilt ornaments, menuki, were often intricate masterpieces of metalwork carved with dragons, flowers, or scenes from mythology. The hilt was covered in the rough white skin of a rei, samagawa, to provide a secure grip, and then meticulously wrapped in silk or leather braid, ito, in complex traditional patterns. The scabbard, saya, was carved from wood, precisely fitted to the blade, and then covered in dozens of layers of lacquer. a process that could take months. The finished sword was more than the sum of its parts. It was a concentration of immense skill, labor, and spiritual intent from a dozen different masters. It was an object that contained a fundamental, brutal duality. It was an object of breathtaking beauty, its folded steel pattern like a landscape in a Sumi-e painting, its temper line like a mist-shrouded mountain range. It was designed to be venerated, to be placed on a special stand, katana keiki, and admired like a great work of art. And it was, at the same time, one of the most brutally efficient tools for severing human flesh, bone, and sinew ever devised by human hands. Its purpose, its entire reason for being, was to kill, to maim, to dismember. It was art, and it was atrocity. And in this duality, the sword is the perfect and final metaphor for the samurai himself. The samurai, too, was forged in a brutal process, his childhood a relentless hammering and folding to beat out the impurities of fear, compassion, and individuality. He was coated in the clay of a rigid code of conduct, heated in the fires of unforgiving discipline, and then plunged into the cold water of a society that demanded he be hard, sharp, and perfectly formed, or else break and be discarded. He, too, was polished by a lifetime of ritual, poetry, and etiquette, his rough edges smoothed away to create an outward appearance of serene, controlled beauty. But beneath that polished surface, his fundamental purpose was violence. He was a living weapon, a paradox of Zen meditation and battlefield butchery, of refined aesthetics and savage cruelty. The samurai is gone. His world is dust. The code he lived by seems alien, its demands monstrous. But the things he created, the stories he left behind, and most of all, the blades he carried, remain. And to hold a true katana in your hands is a deeply unsettling and profound experience. It feels alive, its beauty is hypnotic, but its honesty is brutal. It does not hide its purpose. It is the perfect, final testament to the brutal life of its master. A life of impossible demands, of relentless forging, a life spent walking a razor's edge between sublime beauty and unthinkable violence. It is the soul of the samurai, captured forever in a cold, unforgiving, and perfect piece of steel. And so, our journey is over. The silence of your quiet room, once filled with the clash of steel, the whispers of assassins, and the roar of the Tatara, now returns. The ghosts we have summoned, the boy with terror-scoured eyes, the warrior kneeling in the mud to claim his bloody prize, the masterless ronin selling his soul for a bowl of rice, the kamikaze pilot writing his last letter home, can now recede back into the shadows of the past from which they came. The story is told, the blade is sheathed, but the unsettling questions left in its wake linger in the air, as sharp and as cold as the winter moon. We have walked a long and brutal road together. We began with a child, not raised but forged, his humanity systematically hammered out of him until only a vessel of duty and death remained. We stood with him on the chaotic, blood-soaked battlefields of the Sengoku Jidai, where honor was a currency counted in severed heads. We felt the profound spiritual vertigo of the Great Peace, a cage of gilded irrelevance where the warrior's purpose rotted from within, replaced by the petty tyranny of Kirisuta Gomen and the slow, grinding despair of the masterless man. We witnessed the final, feverish death throes of his era in the Bakumatsu, a convulsive civil war where samurai butchered samurai in the name of competing loyalties. We watched with a sense of mounting dread as his spirit metastasized, possessing a modern nation and driving it to commit atrocities on a scale that would have horrified even its most bloodthirsty feudal ancestors. And finally, we have seen his ghost, tamed and romanticized, find a strange and hollow afterlife in the worlds of corporate commerce and popular entertainment. What then are we left with? After stripping away the layers of myth, of cinematic glory, of nostalgic honor, who was the samurai? He was, in the end, a terrible and beautiful contradiction. He was a man who could arrange flowers with a sublime and gentle touch in the morning and decapitate a man with a single, fluid motion in the afternoon. He was a man who could be moved to tears by the fleeting beauty of a single cherry blossom, yet feel nothing as he oversaw the execution of a peasant for a minor offense. He was a philosopher who sought enlightenment in the void of no mind, yet whose life was governed by a set of rules so rigid, so intricate, and so demanding that it left no room for individual thought. He was the perfectly polished vessel for atrocity, the living embodiment of the terrifying human capacity to fuse profound aesthetic refinement with profound cold-blooded cruelty. And perhaps this is why this figure, more than any other warrior in history, still holds such a potent power over our collective imagination. We are not drawn to the reality of the samurai. The reality, as we have seen, was a nightmare of fear, repression, and violence. No, we are drawn to the idea of the samurai, an idea that we ourselves have helped to create. In a modern world that often feels chaotic, purposeless, and morally ambiguous, we project onto the samurai a desperate desire for order. We see his code, his bushido, and we imagine a life of clarity, a world where the rules are simple and the path is clear. We see his discipline, his self-mastery, and we see a remedy for our own anxieties and indulgences. We see his willingness to die for a cause, and we feel a pang of longing for a purpose that profound in our own, often comfortable but spiritually adrift lives. Our fascination is a form of curation. We cherry-pick the elements of the samurai that we find appealing, the Zen aesthetics, the loyalty, the cool swords, the stoic calm, and we conveniently discard the rest. We edit out the institutionalized domestic abuse, the class-based murder, the political backstabbing, the grotesque reality of the head-viewing ceremony. We create a highlight reel, a romantic fiction, because the unedited truth is too unsettling to confront. The samurai becomes a mirror, but one that we have carefully angled to show us only what we want to see, a reflection of our own idealized virtues. But if we are to truly learn the lesson of the samurai, we must force ourselves to look at the whole, unvarnished picture. For the samurai is not just a historical figure, he is an archetype, a cautionary tale written in blood and steel. He is a testament to the universal human instinct to create codes, to build systems of belief that justify our actions and give us a sense of purpose. He is a warning about what happens when such a code demands the total annihilation of the individual self, when loyalty supplants morality, when obedience becomes the highest virtue. The samurai code did not make men better. It made them more effective. It did not make them more honorable. It made them more obedient. It took all the complex, messy, contradictory impulses of a human being and sublimated them into a single, terrifying imperative: serve and kill. This is a human story, not just a Japanese one. We see echoes of this impulse everywhere, throughout history and even today. We see it in the knightly chivalry that masked the brutal reality of feudal warfare, in the religious fanatic who commits atrocities in the name of a merciful God, in the political ideologue who sacrifices millions for a utopian vision, in the corporate soldier who sacrifices his family and his health for the good of a company. The samurai is simply the most aesthetically refined and philosophically complex version of this timeless and dangerous human tendency. And so we end where we began, with the sword. The katana. It lies before us now, not as a weapon, but as a silent teacher, a cold oracle. Its polished surface does not just reflect the light, it reflects us. It asks us to consider our own lives. What is the code we live by? What are the things we serve, consciously or unconsciously? What are the impurities we have hammered out of ourselves to fit into our own society? What cruelties, small or large, do we accept or ignore in the name of order, of tradition, of loyalty? We look at the blade, at its sublime beauty, and we are awed. We consider its brutal purpose, and we are horrified. The final, unsettling lesson of the samurai is that these two things are not opposites. They are, and have always been, inextricably bound together, two sides of the same, perfectly forged piece of steel. And the line between the two is as thin and as sharp as its edge. Thank you for listening.